I'm glad to see everyone here, and it's a wonderful evening. The weather is amazing, and I'm very appreciative of seeing you all. My name is Joseph Evans, and I have the privilege of serving here at the Berkeley School of Theology, professor of theology in the public square, as well as the J. Alfred Smith Professor of Theology in the Public Square, director for the Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Restorative Justice. So it's my job tonight to kind of give us some a welcome, but also just to give you some housekeeping notes. On the first hand, if you and I were to go back out the door here into Fleming Hall, just on your left, there is a restroom for you and me. And believe it or not, just upstairs, if you go in the building there, just upstairs, there are 2 restrooms. In fact, I just went up there to check, and they're up there, everybody told me. And so, but it's kind of like going to Hogsworth. If you've ever seen Harry Potter, you can get lost in there. So just follow the rules and the directions. But we're very appreciative. Secondly, we are going live, and I want to take privilege first to welcome people from Atlanta. I know people from Atlanta are viewing us tonight. I want to thank people from New Jersey that I know are viewing tonight. And I want to thank people from my hometown of Lewisburg, West Virginia, are watching tonight. And then finally, my West Virginia Institute of Technology Black alumni are watching tonight, except for the few who will watch football. And I just don't know what's wrong with those fellas. But so we're very grateful for the people who have arrived. I think that's really what we need to know. The occasion is simple. We've come here tonight to hear a prominent and national figure share with us some of the salient issues of our day. I will not say any more than that because we have someone to introduce you. I know we're friends, but I have to do my thing and let others do theirs. We have a program that you don't see, but the people who are on program know when they're going to get up. And each person will introduce themselves. And so we think it will be a treat. All right. How are you excited about being here? Anyone besides me? Yeah. Well, with no further ado, it is my privilege then to introduce to us and present to most of us the president of Berkeley School of Theology, Dr. James E. Brenneman, who's also professor of biblical studies. And he is on his way right now.
Thank you, Dr. Evans, and let me extend my welcome to you all from Berkeley School of Theology. My task this evening is to just give you a short, brief history of this wonderful institution. Berkeley School of Theology was conceived during the exciting days of the California Gold Rush, born in the heady post-Civil War days of the first Reconstruction period, right after the Emancipation Proclamation. So think about 1865 to 1877. We were actually born in 1871. That very same year, the first Civil Rights Act of 1871 was passed by Congress to combat the KKK and other white supremacist organizations in the post-slavery era. Lord, we wish that would have lasted. Of course, that piece of legislation would be sidelined a short 7 years later by the Confederate States' retrenchment into states' rights and Jim Crow rule. Sound familiar? Still, along with the founding of Berkeley School of Theology in that era, that exciting era, the American Baptist Home Mission Society also established at this time our historically Black sister colleges for formerly enslaved people, Morehouse, Spelman, Virginia Union. They also founded University of Chicago, and later the indigenous colleges of Ottawa University and Bacone. One of the 4 ministers that officiated at Abraham Lincoln's funeral was an early president of this esteemed Berkeley School of Theology. I share this bit of history to say that the spiritual DNA of BST, from its inception, has been frontier-like, outside the box, border crossing, bridge building, prophetically inspired, ecumenical in its ethos, and intercultural to our bones. And today, it's one of the 10 most diverse seminaries in the United States at all levels, boardroom, classroom, student body, alums, all levels of the institution. We bear this history with honor and seek to continually to live up to our noble beginnings. During the second Reconstruction period, let's call it the Civil Rights era, in the United States, Berkeley School of Theology continued to be nourished and guided forward by some of the leading lights of the Civil Rights era, nationally and internationally, serving on our faculty, on our board, among our graduates, and many stakeholders. Now, 155 years later and going strong, we have entered and wish to be once again at the forefront of preparing leaders of discernment for the church and the world for such a time as this. Let's call it the third Reconstruction period. And we've learned from Dr. Evans, this is our aspiration, and it could also be the time of a new civil war. So let's hope it's the third Reconstruction, though the jury is still out on that. Still, come what may, we will continue to prepare our graduates to lead the church and the world in the holy truth-telling, racial healing, reparative justice, the tikkun olam of the Jewish tradition, the healing of the world, intercultural teaching and learning, alongside a vibrant, irascible hope. Si se puede. Yes, we can. Having shared just a bit of our history, I'm especially aware of all the ancestors who have gone before us, and all of you who embody the Spirit here this evening. We're on holy ground here. Thus, it's appropriate that we approach the divine throne in invocation. Please join me in prayer. Eternal God, we've gathered in the spirit of our ancestors, especially in the spirit of our brother, Jesus of Nazareth, and all those who lived, labored, and loved among us, and taught us that in all our many multiplicities, at core, we are one family, one human family. Encircle us this evening with your divine love, whose center is nowhere, whose circumference is everywhere. Open our hearts to hear what the Spirit wishes to teach us through our sister Amanda. Teach us, guide us, strengthen us to resist Christian nationalism in all its forms, to fight the good fight of fierce love. We pray, Lord of love, for the miracle of enemy love, that we might truly become the one beloved community, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. In your many holy names we pray. Amen.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Leanne Snowflesher. I'm the Vice President of Academics, Dean of the Faculty, and Professor of Biblical Interpretation here at Berkeley School of Theology. And on August 1st of this year, I celebrated 30 years at this institution. This evening, I also want to welcome out there in Zoom land, our students. A large number of our student population is distanced, and they are on screen tonight. We can't see them, but they can see us, and so welcome to them. Many others had been welcome, but I want to make sure they feel welcome too, because they are part of the BST family. In preparation for this lecture this evening, BST held a 2-day convening on Christian nationalism. And at this convening, we had faith leaders from the Bay Area, a few from out of state, who gathered together to have conversations on that topic, Christian nationalism. 4 panels of professors and church leaders and 1 judge brought brief papers that sought to answer 4 key questions. First, what is Christian nationalism? Defining it. Second, how does Christian nationalism threaten democracy? Third, how does Christian nationalism threaten Christianity and religious freedom? And finally, what can we do? The convening was a great success. It encouraged all of us who attended to work together toward bringing the gospel, that is, the good news of Jesus of Nazareth, the good news of the Jesus who we find in the Gospels, the one who in Luke 4:17-19 unrolled the scroll of Isaiah, and when the Spirit of the Lord had fallen on him, he proclaimed, having been anointed, he brought good news to the poor. He proclaimed the release of the captives, as well as recovery of sight to the blind. The one who, after having been anointed, set those who were oppressed free from their bondage, as he proclaimed the year of the Lord's favor. Dr. Amanda Tyler, thank you for being with us this evening. Bring us some good news so we might be set free and so we might see.
Buenas tardes. Good evening, everyone. Bienvenidos. Welcome. My name is Eric Cias. I am the Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies here and the Director of the Latina and Latino programs for our Berkeley School of Theology. And I've been asked to speak a little bit about our Latina and Latino programs here. And so just a brief little history here about a little bit about 10 years ago, BST, 3 people here, Dr. Flesher and 2 team members envisioned a program that was meant to be affordable, accessible, and accelerated for church leaders and lay people in the Latino community, in the Latino church seeking formal education. Now, this vision turned into a certificate program, a bachelor's equivalency, then called the Iniciativa Latina, Latino Initiative, now El Entrenamiento de Liderazgo Cristiano, or ELC, as we call it in short, which empowers those seeking formal education and critical thinking skills to take to their church communities. There's been a little bit of ups and downs for sure within these past 13 years, but what I can confidently say now is that the amount of graduates we're now getting from the certificate program, that we have now been able to form a master's in Spanish. Yes, thank you. So our master's in theological studies, emphasis in leadership, which is kind of the big craze right now within the Latino community and the Latino church. So it's something that we're very proud of. It's looking very good right now, the numbers, and we are very hopeful for the future for the master's in Spanish program. And finally, I just wanted to give a quick thank you here to BST, to the administration and faculty, Dr. Hannah Kang, for example, because run the program together, Dr. Torgerson as well too, that the 3 of us together working at it, along of course with Dr. Flesher, of just a thank you for your support and for the fact that because of this program now, so many people on the margins and that would have not had access to formal education now do and now have that opportunity. So thank you.
Another good evening. to all of you. My name is Dr. Brian Leander, and I recently joined the family at BST, but it's becoming less recent as time goes on. It's been about a year and a half, incredible year and a half. So I have two roles, and they're, because we're a small institution, which tends to add ands to people's titles. I can imagine that there might be a third one coming, if I do a good job. But right now, it's Associate Professor and Director of Intercultural Leadership. Let me tell you a little bit about how the Director of Intercultural Leadership part came about. I met our president many years ago when he was at a previous institution which had a Center for Intercultural Learning. And we had not run in the same circles. I was a lowly adjunct, and he then was the president. But we met fortuitously at an outing with Lilly, the Lilly Foundation, and in the short time that we spoke together and heard each other, we realized that there was something happening here. And Jim later came to this fine school and called me up, and he seemed very happy that he was here and thought I might be happy here too. It took a little while to get there, but he convinced me that this institution truly understands what it means to be intercultural, that it's not multicultural, which means to me that you and I might be from different culture groups and we have some proximity to each other. We're not cross-cultural, which means that you and I are from different culture groups, but we might transact business or some sort of transaction together. But BST is truly intercultural. We are intentional about having relationships with each other and sharing something. So I thought, I got the vision, a shared vision. What would that look like in the learning environment where people from different culture groups come together, not just to have learning unpacked for them, but that we all do the unpacking together from our own perspectives. And I'll just tell you that that's why I have a difficult time keeping track of my time here at BST, because time flies when you're having fun. And I'm having a terrible amount of fun right now. So join me in that. We look forward to the future of us boasting more about our intercultural identity. It's the one thing I don't think we do enough of. We're very modest about who we are. I'm trying to get us to get over that. So give me another 2 years and I'll get to it. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Yvonne Watson. I'm the Director of Finance and the CFO here at Berkeley School of Theology. And my job is to introduce our speaker, Amanda Tyler. Although our partial program has a lot about her, so I'm just going to give you a little extra that's not written there. First of all, her book is coming out on October 22nd. It's being published by broadleafbooks.com. You can order it on your phone. I did. They'll send you an immediate notification that they have your order, and you'll have your book on the 22nd. So get your books, and you can read up on everything that she's going to be talking to us about tonight. But I'm going to tell you a few things that's not on the program. That she's originally from Austin, Texas, where she grew up hearing about the cherished Baptist principles of religious liberty and the separation of church and state as a member of the Highland Park Baptist Church. Because she was committed to these principles, Amanda sought out BJC when she moved to Washington to attend Georgetown University, and she began to volunteer in their office. She later graduated from the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown with a bachelor's degree in foreign service. She was hired by BJC to serve as assistant to the general counsel. She left BJC briefly to attend the University of Texas School of Law. and she returned to BJC to lead the organization in 2016 and began her tenure as executive director in January of 2017. So we welcome her and we look forward to everything that she has to say. And please, before you leave tonight, log in broadleafbooks.com on your phone. We have Wi-Fi, and order your book.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Am I on back there? I think so. Okay, we'll make sure. Thank you so much for that introduction. It is such a joy to be here. My first time on campus. I knew it was a special place, but I'm so glad to have had all of those different pieces so we know everything that's going on this campus. Thank you to President Brenneman for having me, and thank you to Dr. Evans, who had a vision for this event, who said, we got to get you to Berkeley. And I said, well, we'll make it happen, and here it is. And I did get to be part of the convening this afternoon for a brief time, and what an incredible place of learning and of advocacy and of relationship building and organizing. And I'm so pleased that this occasion was able to expand to be more than tonight's lecture, but to really be a catalyst for deeper action in this area. So one request before we get started, one thing, I'm sure that you all brought your phones here tonight, because where do we go without our phones? But I have some QR codes throughout tonight's presentation. And so I would just love to know that you're here tonight. And so this first QR code is just a request, just to fill out a short online form before you leave. And that's a great way for me to be able to stay in touch with you. The other information on this first slide is how to stay in touch with me after the night and the work of BJC and the work of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We are on every social media platform that you can think of, including TikTok at End Christian Nationalism. And so would love for you to be engaged in our work online. So, and I'll put that QR code back up at the end. So if you missed it on the first time, there'll be another chance. So tonight we are going to talk about Christian nationalism and understand the threat it poses to democracy, understand the threat it poses to religious freedom for all people, and understand the threat it poses to an authentic Christian witness. And then I'm not going to leave you high and dry about the doomsday situation, but we're going to start talking about what do we do to work together on interventions. The 2-day convening basically did this presentation over 2 days. So if you were part of the convening, I hope that some of this is an effective reinforcement of what you already talked about, and it brings us all up to the same level of information. Before we get into talking about the threat and what we do about it, I think it's very important that we have a common understanding of exactly what we're talking about. And so I'm going to offer some definitions for our conversation here tonight. I'm not claiming that they are the perfect definitions, but if you are going to understand, if we're all going to understand what we're talking about, I think having some parameters around definitions is important. So the first definition I'm going to offer is a definition of religious nationalism. Religious nationalism is a fusion of religious and national identities. And it's a recurrent problem throughout history and around the world today. Religious nationalism is a very old problem. In the Christian tradition, I think Christian nationalism is at least as old as the Emperor Constantine. The first time that the Christian religion was taken by the power of the state and imposed the empire in that situation and imposed on everyone else. And that the force of the empire, the violent force of the empire, would impose faith on other people. It would take this religion of inclusion and use it as a means of exclusion, of drawing lines between who is in and who is out. We can look around the world today and see so many other examples of religious nationalism. To name just a few countries: Russia, India, Hungary, Zambia, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and, of course, the horrific situation that's happening with Israel in their war with Hamas and now also with Hezbollah, and how religious nationalism is playing a role in that heartbreaking and horrific conflict. But for tonight, so I think it's important that we think about this in a global perspective. But tonight's presentation is going to zero in on the problem of American Christian nationalism. And so the definition, and this QR code will take you to christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org, where we have a lot of information that I'm going to be presenting tonight that you can go back and refer to later. So the definition that we have used at Christians Against Christian Nationalism is this one. Christian nationalism is a political ideology and a cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identity. Put another way, Christian nationalism suggests that to be a real American, one has to be a Christian. And not just any kind of Christian, but a Christian who holds fundamentalist religious beliefs that are in line with conservative political priorities. The beliefs follow the priorities, not the other way around. They are thoroughly merged into one. Christian nationalism is a very old problem, and I'm going to talk about some of the history and some of the earlier instances of Christian nationalism in the United States context. I define it here as a political ideology and a cultural framework, and that's going to be the majority of what I talk about tonight. But to have a full understanding of Christian nationalism, I think we also have to think of it as a well-funded and highly organized political movement. And it's the movement part and the rise of the power of the movement part of Christian nationalism that is driving the current high tide of Christian nationalism in our culture. There have been previous high tides of Christian nationalism in the United States during the Civil War, during the early 20th century, during the 1950s. And we are, yet again, right now at this high tide of Christian nationalism, both because of the political ideology and the cultural framework, but also because of the political movement that is trying to enforce Christian nationalism through its securing of power and holding on to power at all costs, using any cost. The next definition I want to provide is one of white Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. Some may say that you can't understand Christian nationalism without understanding white supremacy. And I believe in the American context that is the case. That's because Christian nationalism creates and perpetuates a sense of cultural belonging that's limited to the people who were included in the founding of the United States. Is this not working? Okay. I'm happy to. Thank you. I'm glad that the online audience is listening in. I'm hoping they'll tell me if this doesn't work as well. So Christian nationalism creates and perpetuates a sense of cultural belonging that's limited to the people who were included fully in the founding of the United States. That's white, Protestant, Christian men who owned property. Those were the only people who had full rights of citizenship. Everyone else was relegated to a lower caste system based on their identities. And white Christian nationalism tells the story that that is what should continue to be the case. The Christian in white Christian nationalism is much more about ethno-national identity than it is about a certain religion or theology. It's the identity of whiteness. And there are so many examples from American history that point to this ideology of white Christian nationalism. One particularly clear example is the KKK, course, the KKK is still around now, but 100 years ago, it was a mainstream organization. Millions of Americans were members of the KKK. It had a toxic mix of white supremacy, Christian nationalism, and violence. Now, I will often use these two terms interchangeably, white Christian nationalism and Christian nationalism, but often, like in the title of my book, How to End Christian Nationalism, in the campaign, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, I tend to prefer Christian nationalism for this reason. As we will find out a little bit later when we're looking at how Christian nationalism is measured, you don't have to be white to embrace Christian nationalism. And I think sometimes if we call it white Christian nationalism, it sends a signal, the opposite signal, that you do have to be white. But I also don't want to ignore all of the overlaps there are with white supremacy in talking about Christian nationalism. So the terms are interchangeable, but the ideology impacts us all, regardless of our identities. I want to talk through some of the markers of Christian nationalism. And one of them is this heavy reliance on the mythological founding of the United States as a quote-unquote Christian nation. Now, when people say America is a Christian nation, they are not usually talking about it in a demographic sense. It's true that throughout history, a majority of Americans has identified in some way as a Christian. Now, that number has continued to decline over time, and that decline has something to do with the rise of Christian nationalism, particularly within the political movement right now. But that's not what America is a Christian nation proponents usually mean. Rather, they are suggesting that America was founded by Christians in order to privilege Christianity in law and policy. They have a story that there is an emphasis of God's providential hand in the past history and in present politics. And in this way, Christian nationalism has real theological problems, right? The Gospel of John says, "For God so loved the world." Doesn't say, "For God so loved the United States." But the mythology of America as a Christian nation tells that story. It says God loves the United States more. God has a special plan for the United States. Some people who embrace the ideology actually say that the founding documents were divinely inspired, right? They emphasize the religious biographies of certain founders. They ignore the more problematic founders, like Jefferson, who used his scissors to cut up his Bible to take all the miracles out. But they emphasize and they cherry pick quotes to emphasize their Protestant Christianity and to suggest that they were not just political leaders, but religious leaders as well. This ideology is not just theologically problematic, it's problematic for a pluralistic democracy as well. It also happens to be bad history and bad constitutional history. In the constitutional history, the founders made a very deliberate choice to disestablish religion. They had experienced what established religion looked like. They knew what a Christian nation looked like because they were living under one in the British Empire, where there was a total merger of church and state in the leader of the empire. And so they made a deliberate choice to disestablish religion. And so that founding document that some people say was divinely inspired, the U.S. Constitution, it makes no mention of God. It makes no mention of Jesus or Christianity. And the only mention of religion is in Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution to ban religious tests for public office. And so I tend to think that the founders were very complicated people, but they were smart. And if they really wanted to found a Christian nation, this is about the most ineffective way you would design a Christian nation, is to prohibit from the very beginning any test of religion in order to hold public office. So this mythology of a Christian nation is, I think, rather easily rebutted, but it is a persistent story that has allowed Christian nationalism to flourish for these many centuries. I want to turn now to distinguishing Christian nationalism first from Christianity. Christian nationalism, because it merges religious and national identities into one, can lead to idolatry, because it can very easily confuse our allegiances, and it can very easily lead to worshiping the state over worshiping God, loving our neighbors. It is also a gross distortion of the teachings of Jesus. Christian nationalism is all about power. And Jesus was all about standing with the marginalized and the people who were being oppressed by that power. Jesus turned everything upside down. The power of Jesus comes not from earthly authorities. Remember the part about the first being last and the last being first? Jesus also spoke truth to power in such a way that he was murdered for it, right? So Jesus has nothing to do with Christian nationalism and the way that it uses Jesus as its mascot. Again, Christian nationalism, the Christian, is more about an ethno-national identity than it is about the teachings of Jesus or any theology or the religion itself. And it carries with it assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and militarism. But it uses the language and the symbols of Christianity, crosses, Bible verses, images of Jesus, a white Jesus, right, in order to stand for this ideology of Christian nationalism in ways that can be confusing to casual observers. And so we as Christians have a lot of work to do to explain to our neighbors how Christian nationalism is not the religion that we identify with, that this is not the Jesus that we have committed our lives to follow and emulate. But in doing so, if we're really authentic about this project, we have to acknowledge the ways that American Christianity has been impacted and polluted by Christian nationalism for centuries. You see, American Christianity has sacrificed the gospel of love on an altar of power throughout our history. And so I'm just going to lead us through a very quick walk through history to show you some of these ways that we've sacrificed our theology to Christian nationalism. European Christianity used Christian theology as the foundation of the doctrine of discovery. That's the deadly heresy that it was God's will for European conquerors to steal land and murder the native inhabitants of North and South America. And then the established church of the empire, the Anglican Church, sacrificed its witness of love for all on the altar to power in 1667. That's when the Assembly in the colony of Virginia, which was composed entirely of white Anglican men, passed a law that said that baptism would not free an enslaved Native American, person of African descent, or mixed race background. They took the Christian theology of freedom through baptism and put it under the law of the land that had taken freedom away from groups of people. And then my tradition, Baptists, and particularly white Baptists in the South, chose power over love when they created the Southern Baptist Convention in 1845. They claimed then that slavery was, quote, an institution of heaven. And then in 1863, they pledged their support to the Confederacy in the Civil War. That same false gospel was used to justify Jim Crow segregation and lynching, with church members often members of the KKK as well. And so when we think about the threat of Christian nationalism in our current day to our democracy, to religious freedom, and to an authentic Christian witness, we have to understand just how old of a problem this is. And part of what makes it so difficult is how Christian nationalism has changed our conceptions of freedom itself. In the place of the freedom of Christ, a freedom to love, we have replaced it with the lie of white supremacy, or what Ta-Nehisi Coates has written about as a, quote, white freedom. I'm going to read something that he wrote several years ago. Quote, white freedom is, quote, a freedom without consequence, freedom without criticism, freedom to be proud and ignorant, freedom to profit off a people in one moment and abandon them in the next. A stand your ground freedom, freedom without responsibility, without hard memory. A Monticello without slavery, a Confederate freedom, the freedom of John C. Calhoun, not the freedom of Harriet Tubman, which calls you to risk your own, not the freedom of Nat Turner, which calls you to give even more, but a conqueror's freedom, freedom of the strong built on antipathy or indifference to the weak. And so this white freedom that Coates writes about is not the freedom of Christ. And we have enslaved ourselves and others in service of power. And so in order to be set free by Christ, we must reject Christian nationalism and its trappings of power, the lie of white supremacy, and return to the teachings of Jesus. And if we're going to do it as Christians, we have to learn the history, and we have to be willing to tell the history. Well, in addition to distinguishing Christian nationalism from Christianity, I want to talk about Christian nationalism versus patriotism. And I want to say from the beginning that patriotism is a complicated topic. Nationalism doesn't think that it's complicated. It's not complicated to be a nationalist because it is just a blind allegiance to country that demands allegiance over everything else, including our allegiances to Jesus. But patriotism, I believe, is a love of country. And like all other kinds of love, it can't be forced. It is freely chosen or it doesn't exist at all. One doesn't have to be patriotic. And if one is patriotic, there are a lot of ways to be patriotic. We can love our country enough to want better for it. We can exercise our First Amendment freedoms, including our freedoms to protest, in order to have a better country for everyone who's living here. We can also wave our flags and say the Pledge of Allegiance and do other kinds of examples of patriotism, as long as we don't put that over our other allegiances or confuse those with what our religious convictions are. And so I want to caution us that as we work to dismantle Christian nationalism, we don't have to abandon patriotism, but we have to, I think, expand our notions of what it means to be patriotic, to include more people in the project of loving our country and keeping our love of country in its proper place with our other allegiances and convictions. So in understanding Christian nationalism, I think it helps for us to get specific about just how prevalent of a problem this is. And again, I'm focusing on the ideology and the cultural framework and not the movement in this part of the presentation. When sociologists and pollsters measure for Christian nationalism in the culture, they ask people how much they agree with statements like these, that the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation, the success of the United States is part of God's plan, the federal government should advocate Christian values. And they ask people, you can strongly agree, strongly disagree, or disagree, strongly disagree. And at this point, you might be going through these yourself, thinking how much Do I agree or disagree with these ideas? You'll notice that these statements really mirror the markers of Christian nationalism we talked about before. And then based on people's responses, they chart them along kind of a spectrum or a continuum of Christian nationalism. This first slide, I'm going to show you two slides, one with older data, one with more recent data. This first slide was published in 2020 from Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. One thing you'll notice is Christian nationalism is not a diagnosis. It's not an immutable quality. It's not something you either have or you don't. It's something you either embrace or reject. And like all surveys, it's a snapshot in time with the particular people who were questioned in this survey. And in this particular survey, things to notice, and this is interesting because the trends have been pretty consistent over time. The smallest group are the ambassadors of Christian nationalism. Those are the people who most strongly embrace Christian nationalism. That may be surprising to you, given what we've talked about the high tide of Christian nationalism. I think this helps us understand that the movement part of Christian nationalism is doing a lot of work right now, a lot of anti-democratic work, because it's not in step with where the majority of American people are. The majority of the American people are in the middle. 60% are either resisting Christian nationalism or accommodating it, not full-on rejecting it or becoming full-on ambassadors. The second slide I want to show you is from data taken last year, 2023, by PRRI. Their statements and questions were similar, not exactly the same. But the trends are remarkably consistent. The smallest group, again, are those who are most embracing Christian nationalism. The adherents is what they call them in this survey. And the biggest are the people in the middle again. 57% here are skeptical or sympathizing with Christian nationalism, but not full-on rejecting it or adhering to it. Now, the 10% is lower than the 19% in the prior slide, and you're saying, wow, that's a big drop in Christian nationalism in just 3 years. Not so fast. One of the questions that they added here measures for the most extreme form of Christian nationalism, something called dominionism or Seven Mountains Mandate. This idea that Christians should take over the government and every other form of society. And so to be in the adherence category here, you had to strongly agree with that statement. So that's pretty alarming to me that 10% of the people surveyed agreed with that statement. If you want to really see kind of how high Christian nationalism is here in this particular survey, they took sympathizers and adherents and added them together. So they said basically 30% of the American public are in some way identifying with Christian nationalism. And the rest, I guess 3% didn't know what to think about it, but the rest, 67%, are wanting to move away from Christian nationalism. That's good news, okay? I think that's really good news that a solid majority of Americans really are not wanting anything to do with Christian nationalism, okay? That's something to work with. So let's just say 30% is the national average. I'm now going to give you a quick geographic breakdown. So I hear some, maybe this isn't surprising. So if the blue and the darker blue states, those are where it's over the national average, and the green and the lighter green states are below the national average, okay? So the highest states are Mississippi, Nebraska, and North Dakota. Those are the only states that actually have a majority of people who are kind of more sympathetic or moving towards Christian nationalism. That might be kind of surprising. I'm from Texas. I was pleasantly surprised that I knew we were over the national average, but we're only 7 points over the national average. Florida, kind of surprising, only 3 points over the national average. California is 19. If they circled Berkeley on the map. I'm guessing it might not even be able to be measured. I don't know. But the whole state of California is 19. So, I don't know how well you can see this slide, but if you want to go to PRRI, you can see all kinds of different breakdowns by different groups on how they measure Christian nationalism. It's really interesting. But the takeaway here, other than the strong you can see a geographic trend pretty strongly here, right? The South and the Midwest. So that's one key takeaway. But the other one is in states like Texas and Florida that have the most extreme policies towards Christian nationalism. It shows how extreme and anti-democratic those elected legislatures really are, because they are not reflecting the majority of the state, right? If you just looked at the policies out of my state, you'd think we'd score 90 on the Christian nationalism scale, not 37, right? And so for Christian nationalism to take over the United States through the halls of power, they have to use anti-democratic measures like gerrymandering, right? Like taking over the US Supreme Court and changing the way that we read the Constitution in ways that are really damaging to voting rights, to religious freedom rights, to reproductive freedom rights, to all of the rights that we hold dear. I told some people this. I was really struck today when I flew into the airport here. The first billboard I saw said, "Welcome to California, where we have abortion rights." And I thought, you really could take out the word abortion and just say, "Welcome to California, where we have rights." That we have returned to a country without equal protection under the law because of the way that our geography determines how many rights we hold as citizens. And this is this is because of the ideology of Christian nationalism and the money and the power that's being poured into the movement that tries to exploit the ideology in order to do this. I'm going to give a couple of examples of Christian nationalism and then talk about what we're going to do and then be able to take a few questions. So one of the most, I think, well-known examples of Christian nationalism is the very recognizable slide on the right from January 6, 2021, where there were so many symbols of Christian nationalism, and the ideology was used to really bring together all these disparate groups and give them a common language, common symbolism, and common religious fervor to try to overturn the lawful results of the 2020 presidential election. The slide on the left is from January 6, 2023, when a group of faith leaders, including myself, gathered across the street from the US Capitol at dawn for us to bear remembrance to January 6th and to talk about the role that Christian nationalism played in the insurrection. And we decided to have this demonstration, this vigil, because just a few weeks earlier, the Select Committee of the January 6th Select Committee in Congress released their hundreds and hundreds of pages of report. And we at BJC, along with our friends at Freedom from Religion Foundation, had put out a report about January 6th and the insurrection. We had provided it to Congress. When they received it, they asked us for testimony, expert testimony. We submitted the expert testimony. And when their report came out, they never mentioned Christian nationalism. And I have theories. There were some articles written at the time about the fact that people on the committee, including Liz Cheney, said that we can't talk about Christian nationalism because we're Christians. We can't attack Christianity, so we're just not going to mention Christian nationalism. And so this unfortunately, was not terribly surprising, but it told me that we have to normalize talking about Christian nationalism. And Christians need to be the ones that are leading the way in normalizing and talking about Christian nationalism. And if we don't do that, then how can we expect our elected officials to take what is apparently a brave act to speak out against it. And I'll say I'm actually going to be in conversation tomorrow in Marin County with Congressman Jared Huffman, who is the only member of Congress to ever make a floor speech against Christian nationalism. He is also the only member of Congress who is openly non-religious. He's a humanist. And so I talked with him for my book. I wrote about him in my new book, and we're going to be in conversation tomorrow about joining forces, across lines of difference to oppose Christian nationalism. Well, this is a really extreme example of Christian nationalism, but there are lots of other opportunities for us to oppose Christian nationalism, including in our very churches. Because of that history that I talked about earlier, about how Christian nationalism has polluted Christian theology, we have a lot of symbols of Christian nationalism in our religious spaces. We have it in flags in the sanctuary. We have it even in the existence of a Christian flag itself, which was put out at a time of great nationalism in the United States and around the world. We have it in patriotic songs in our hymnals. We have it in ways that we interpret Scripture in line with American empire. We have so much work to do to extricate Christian nationalism from our own Christian theology. And that is a lot of the work that we try to do at Christians Against Christian Nationalism. In addition, we have a lot of Christian nationalism in our public schools. This is a picture of a public school somewhere in America which has the U.S. motto on its wall. Now, a little bit about the U.S. motto, "In God We Trust." It only became the motto in the 1950s. Before that, our motto was "E pluribus unum," out of many one. But 1950s, also a high tide of Christian nationalism, and so Congress passed a law to change our motto to "In God We Trust." But in recent years, there's been a concerted, intentional effort to pass laws requiring the posting of the motto like this in public schools, and more than a dozen states have passed these laws. And the reason is to reinforce this Christian nation mythology, this idea that to be a true American, one has to believe in God, and that is to understand American culture is somehow to also understand this kind of civil religion. But we have a lot of other examples of Christian nationalism in education policy disputes. The teaching of a Christian nation mythology in place of a more honest history. The use of Judeo-Christian values is often a sign that there's some Christian nationalism. This idea, again, trying to appear inclusive, but actually being quite dismissive of Judaism as an independent religion and using it as here as just a modifier of Christianity. The requiring of posting of "In God We Trust" in public schools, or more recently, state of Louisiana became the first state to require the posting of the Ten Commandments in public schools. Again, based on this false notion that the Ten Commandments are the basis of American law. How many people have heard that before? All law is based on the Ten Commandments. It's not true, right? But they just repeat it over and over again. And it suggests that to understand the laws of our state, we have to study the Ten Commandments. We see it in teaching Bible in the curriculum. And this isn't about teaching religious literacy. This is about actually teaching the Bible devotionally, or teaching the Bible as a political text. And what I mean by that is saying, as the superintendent of schools in Oklahoma has said, that in order to understand the Constitution, you have to read the Bible. Again, furthering this idea that the Constitution is divinely inspired or that the Constitution is somehow based on biblical values. In Texas, though, you might not have heard about what's happening in Texas with Bible in the curriculum. It is actually much worse than what's happening in Oklahoma. So Oklahoma, there's a lot of posturing and rhetoric, and there's a lot of wasteful spending because they're proposing in a state that already totally underfunds their public schools to spend $6 million to buy Trump's God Bless the USA Bible. But in Texas, But the Bible, though, I mean, it really is just a prop, right? They're just going to buy these Bibles, they're going to put them in the classroom, and teachers can sit there and ignore them if they want. In Texas, they've actually written a new curriculum on how to teach reading and language arts to kids in elementary school, kids as young as kindergarten. And they've decided that we'll just teach kids to read by reading Bible stories. And so but children as young as kindergarten can't really discern the difference between a faith claim and a fact claim, right? And this major authority in their life, their public school teacher, is going to be teaching them the resurrection story out of the Bible as a way to learn to read. So this is actually an action that we at BJC, and I'll talk about it in a moment, have actually done some advocacy against, to explain that because we are Baptists and we believe in Bible freedom, we don't want the state using any religious text, including our own, to teach our public school children. We also see it with content bans, like the Don't Say Gay bills or book bans. And then again, Texas, being a leader in the Christian Nationalist Department, was the first of its kind to pass a school chaplain law, which encouraged the hiring or accepting as volunteers school chaplains into the public school curriculum. Well, we're here at a theological school. Chaplaincy is great. You might wonder, like, how do they define chaplains? They define chaplains as anyone who can pass a criminal background check. Full stop. No special licensing, no special training, no ability to work with children, and no restriction on what they can say or do with the children. So they can proselytize, they can engage in religious counseling. And in Texas, they actually rejected a proposed amendment to require parental consent. But the way the law was written, it didn't automatically take effect. It then went to the 1,200 school districts across the state of Texas for each school district to decide whether they wanted to adopt the program. And BJC was involved with other groups in helping people understand how harmful this new law would be to religious freedom rights. We helped organize people to go and talk to their school board members. And of the 1,200 school districts across the state of Texas, I know of one that decided to move in this direction. It's another example of how the extreme policies in the legislature do not reflect the views of people on the ground, even in a conservative state, right? Even in a state that has a lot of Christian practice and a lot of Christian supremacy still in the state, that this was not something, this went too far, and they could see the divisive effect this would have and the harmful effect on religious freedom this could have. So I don't want to leave us all depressed about the state of the world. And so I want to talk a little bit about what we can do to push back. At BJC, we've been pushing back for more than 5 years now through our leadership of the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign. And many of you here in this room and watching online have joined the campaign. If you haven't joined the campaign, you can sign the statement. You can become a public member of the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign. It is a statement of principles, not a statement of faith. But principles of religious freedom for all that can unite us across lines of religious difference, and that can, again, normalize Christians speaking out against Christian nationalism. We also have on the website a number of resources. We have a podcast series, webinars, reading guides and discussion guides that go along with those, curriculum that you can download for free, one-pagers. These are all resources to help raise awareness in our communities around Christian nationalism. And then, as mentioned earlier, the newest resource is my book, How to End Christian Nationalism. And this book comes out, there are a lot of books out there, excellent books out there to help understand Christian nationalism. Why I took the time I didn't have to write a book is because when I went out and spoke about this issue in groups, the first question and the most common question I got is, what can I do? And I wrote this book as a way for people to have a handhold, a way of like, this problem can seem so big and so amorphous that we are paralyzed with a feeling of helplessness about it. And we are not helpless with this problem. And if we are silent in this moment, we are complicit with this problem. And so this book, I hope, will add to the conversation and inspire people to action. And so I wrote the book, the chapters are steps. They're steps to educate ourselves, to advocate, and to engage in community organizing, because we really believe that awareness, advocacy, and community organizing together are the tools that we need to do to really dismantle Christian nationalism. And so to that end, we've started a pilot project in North Texas for community organizing. We hired a field organizer who works on the ground there. And we're learning lessons to help scale and hopefully help work with volunteers in other areas of the country who are interested in getting involved in local organizing. And some of the examples of our activities, we have coalition meetings, one-on-ones, public events like speakers and film screenings, public demonstrations, and advocacy trainings and actions. And so that curriculum I was telling you about earlier, we help train people to read the curriculum. Once they read it, they were horrified to see how it was using the Bible in these public school classrooms, how to register their complaint through public comment, which is a very inaccessible process. They make it very difficult for everyday people to engage in this. And then we also train them on how to go testify in front of the State Board of Education. We even helped arrange transportation for people from other parts of the state to go to Austin for a public hearing that was held in September. And those of us who were concerned about Christian nationalism and who were opposed to the curriculum, outnumbered the people who were there to speak for the curriculum by more than 3 to 1. And my favorite moment of the advocacy, I did not hear it myself, someone else told me, but there was a group from Moms for Liberty there, and they were like, how did they get all these people? We really need to work harder in this state if we're gonna, and Moms for Liberty is pretty strong in a lot of states, including Texas. So their resistance works, but it takes a lot of work to do it. And so if I leave you with the thought here, like, what can I do? Getting involved in your local community is the single best way, I think, to work to dismantle Christian nationalism. And you all who live in this area are way ahead of the game on local community organizing. So you have coalitions to join in and work with to build the beloved community and to push back against Christian nationalism. Thank you.
Would you be willing to answer a couple questions?
Love to.
All right. If we have just maybe 2 questions, 3 at the best. I'm going to try to give people who are not on program first opportunity. One over here from a faculty member, one back here. Okay. You're going to have to come forward because I don't know. We do? Okay. Eric, back it up.
Amanda, thank you so much for your profoundly astute comments and helping us to be more aware. In your almost final comment, you mentioned Moms for Liberty. And today we were talking about how the use of rhetoric in this Christian nationalism movement uses terms that we're familiar with and therefore assume we would understand. And yet I would ask you to just help us use this as an example to explain what Moms for Liberty is.
I mean, I'm a mom and I love liberty, but I'm not a mom for liberty, right? Because that group has really done a lot of organizing, and they are well organized and they are highly funded, and they've done a lot of organizing to show up at school board meetings to impose their theology on everyone else. And that's the difference between Christian nationalism and faith-based advocacy, right? For this to be a society where religious freedom is flourishing, we have to be able to bring our faith into our public advocacy. We need to be able to bring our faith to bear in public life, right? Our system of religious freedom is not the French system, right? Where religion is basically like taken out of public conversation. That is not flourishing religious freedom either. But Christian nationalism says that my religious views have to be your religious views and the laws that you live under as well. And so the groups I can't even remember all the names of groups, but they only use about 5 words just in different iterations that are, kind of universally beloved ideas. And that's why, in part, I read that long quote from Coates, is they've changed the conception of what freedom means. But it's not freedom for all, and it's not the biblical freedom from Galatians. For Christ has set us for what wise for no. Galatians 5:1. Christ has set us free for freedom, but not freedom for self-indulgence, is what the text says, but rather in service to one another to show love for our neighbor.
We have one more here. Sir?
Thank you very much. Mine is simple. If I read about the constitution making of United States, I find that religious freedom, especially with the architect, James Madison with his friend Thomas Jefferson, they said that Christianity cannot be touched in whatever way. That's why they included in the First Amendment that a breach, no one should not touch that. Do you think that could be a factor that could contribute to this Christian nationalism? Because if you find even the current political scenario, I don't want to mention the candidate. The candidate said that, Christians, it's high time you have to vote. You have to vote, otherwise it will be done once and for all. So do you think that could be a contributing factor over 200 years ago because of that constitutional making? And another question, I'm so sorry. Okay, I'm about to finish, Professor. One minute, yeah. Thomas Jefferson, the 20th president, who happens to be the Baptist minister, like you are from Baptist, and the most learned president among the 47 presidents of the United States, was the father of the Jim Crow. And what I wonder, by the time the blacks in the South were being lynched, being done all these things during his presidency, despite the fact that in 2019, he was the father of the peace conference in France. What was going on with, because I know Christian is a universal because of the Bible. Yeah, I'm about to finish. So what is, Christian is universal. The way we understand it in Africa, we read the Bible, is the way American reads the Bible. But why is a minister is more like a pastor, supporting lynching of people? That's a big question. It's been haunting me for a bit. Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to take my time to get back because you're going to have to, unless you already got it together.
Yeah, I think so. We might have to continue the conversation after the talk, but my quick response is, because this is probably better in a conversation than just, but my quick response is, I'm glad you brought up the First Amendment, right? The First Amendment, the first 16 words of the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. 2 clauses, no establishment and free exercise. I believe James Madison, father of the Constitution, and someone who was influenced by Baptist, Presbyterians, and others who were being persecuted for not being with the state religion, the Anglican Church, that he wanted to protect religious freedom. But he knew that in order to do so, you needed to disestablish it from government. And there are so many writings from Madison and others that explain that it was because of their respect for religion and religious liberty that the government should have no part in it. And then the second part of the question, I think I somewhat tried to give the history of how one could possibly use the Bible to justify lynching or use the Bible to justify slavery. There is a long history of reading the Bible out of context and reading it to support one's own political agenda, which at the time was the agenda of slavery, and then was at the time the agenda of perpetuating white power, right? And so the gospel itself was polluted, distorted beyond recognition in order to justify that kind of injustice, or try to, right? And so then we're all living with those repercussions with American Christianity. But I'd love to continue the conversation.
Let's give her, I'm sorry. Eric, please come. You surely can, I just didn't.
Do you have time? It's a quick question. So, yeah, right, for me, thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. So quickly, my work now is in trying to deconstruct conspiracy theories and how they use the Bible, right, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, big weapon for Christian nationalism. But what I found the difference is that there's a big difference between adherents and peddlers or pushers of the narrative. And so I'm wondering, because in trying to find a solution to this particular problem with conspiracy theories, I have to do a different approach with adherents and peddlers. So I'm wondering, is that something that the BJC does as well too?
Yeah, I think our work is chiefly trying to expose the peddlers, right? And then hoping, as far as the adherents, I think the best people to talk to adherents are people who are already in close relationship with those people, right? I think that rhetoric, talking points, trying to prove our point, and conspiracy theories a little, well, I think it's really the same too. And it's really done in personal relationship and not on social media, because social media is where the conspiracy theories are taking off like wildfire. And because of all the algorithms, everyone knows this, you're never going to see, you're just going to keep being fed the misinformation and not see the debunking of it. But if you have a close friend or a family member or a pastor or a prayer partner or whoever you're working with that will challenge your source of your information or try to work out, that's the, I think, best person to work with the adherent. The peddlers, and I did go at one point to, as research, not for any other reason, to the Reawaken America tour, which is this traveling roadshow of Christian nationalism, conspiracy theories, election denialism, and trying to sell you a lot of stuff at the same time, right? And so I saw these peddlers of conspiracy theories up close and personal, and I saw how incredibly disingenuous they were. They had these people who were doing their healings and their prophecies about Donald Trump becoming president, and then they'd turn around to their handlers and say, how much more of this? It's clear that this is a business model for them. And so exposing them for what they are is important, but then having someone who trusts that the person who's bought into it can trust and try to work out of that. I actually write about the Reawaken America tour in the book and how they use baptisms at their events. They actually baptize people into Christian nationalism, essentially. There's no liturgy, but they use the symbolism of dunking under the water, and hundreds of people will line up at these events to get baptized. And so that's very hard to work against, right? And no amount of, like I said, talking points, webinars, podcasts are gonna disciple people away from that. But I'm glad that you're focused on. Okay, thanks.
Would you give a Berkeley round of applause? to Amanda Tyler.
Hello, everybody. I'm Derek Dowdy. I'm going to close this out tonight. I am the Student Success and Financial Aid Advisor here at BST, and I joined the family this summer. I'm going to set my own 3 minutes. I'm not going to set it right now because I have housekeeping to do first, but it'll take just a second. So first of all, I want to say thank you very much to Dr. Evans for putting this together. And a round of applause of appreciation for the coordinating. Also, a big round of applause and thanks to the staff, particularly the advancement team, development team. I also want to mention that, I think Amanda might have mentioned it herself, but tomorrow at 1 p.m. at Book Passage, that's in Corte Madera. She'll be there with Jared Huffman to talk about the book, and I hope that you'll all join in. There's also, if you go to endchristiannationalism.com, you'll be able to get resources and potentially purchase the book there as well. So I encourage you to do that. We've got one more announcement, two more from here at BST. The Saturday, November 2nd, from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. There's a presentation on trauma here. You've got this on all of your seats. There's information about this, as well as there's a save the date notification for April 24th, being the spring lecture for the Sentencing Project. So now I will begin. 3 minutes. So you brought up something that has resonated with me from the panels. It was mentioned this morning about Sankofa and the concept of going back to get it or learning from the past to inform your future decisions. And the fact that out of 845 pages of reviewing the January 6th events, that there's only passing mention, not naming Christian nationalism and just passing reference to something that is so at the crux is important for the citizenry to appreciate that certain types of help might not come from the people that hold the reins of power. And it could be time for us to get our acts together. And as a scholar and anthropologist and somebody that worked in Massachusetts on the Du Bois archive, I'm going to use Du Bois's words to inform my closing here. He was very excited about the potential and the power of religion to help heal and hurt, but also the power of the hope in the church and individuals in collective action to create change, leading to the Niagara Music Movement, leading to the NAACP. And I believe that the following is something that he'd agree with, and that's that we face a grave threat to the very fabric of our democracy right now. The rise of Christian white nationalism, this ideology cloaked in the guise of religious and racial superiority, seeks to undermine the principles of equality and justice that are the bedrock of our nation. Christian white nationalism is not merely a political stance, it is a pernicious force that distorts the teachings of Christianity to justify exclusion and oppression. It is a movement that seeks to create a homogeneous society where only those who fit a narrow definition of race and religion are deemed worthy of full citizenship. This is antithetical to the democratic ideals of pluralism and inclusivity. Du Bois would remind us that democracy is not just a system of government, it is a way of life that demands the recognition of the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. He would argue that the true test of a democracy is how it treats its most marginalized members. In a society where Christian white nationalism is allowed to flourish, the rights and freedoms of minorities are constantly under siege. Moreover, Du Bois would highlight the historical context of this threat. He would draw parallels between the current rise of Christian white nationalism and past movements that sought to maintain racial hierarchies and suppress the voices of the oppressed. He would remind us that the struggle for civil rights and social justice is ongoing and that we must remain vigilant in defending the gains we have made. In conclusion, Du Bois would call upon us to reject the divisive and exclusionary rhetoric of Christian white nationalism. Look at that. He would urge us to reaffirm our commitment to the principles of equality, justice, and democracy. Let us stand together, united in our diversity, and work towards a society where every individual is valued and respected. And the last words that I'll say for you to leave with, because I felt a whole lot of belonging, especially through the panels and all of our work together through the tabling and the talking and breaking things down, and ending with this, is that we are not alone with God, each other, our faith, and that the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all as you go into the night. And let's all pray that we do the right thing in this election coming up. So thank you.